thank you for joining me. This is the Warbird Mistress, and I know it's been a while since I had an aircraft-specific video, just things being busy, but here we are. And I want to begin by saying that the French Armée de l'Air in the interwar years is one of those things that makes me glad that while French is my native language, I speak a distinctively North American dialect which will never have me mistaken for being French. And today we explore one of those otter ducks to come out of those years, the Amiot 143. It's a plane whose image has been ridiculed by just about everyone, the French included, and yet she actually embraced several advanced techniques in manufacture and design when she was first produced. Now, to understand her, we can't just mock her according to 1939, 1937, 1935 standards. We need to explore the context of her design. And a good place to start is 1933. In 1933, the ultra-heavy bomber requirements of 1923 were finally met. And the French were looking to take the next the next limp forward was being contemplated. And once the Bloch MB-200 flew in 1933 in response to the 1923 Service Technique Aéronautique specifications for ultra-heavy bombers, the French saw that the design was better than the Loire d'Olivier 206, and that had just entered production, but they needed an even better design. If the MB-200 could do well on 2 Mistral Major engines, then what could it do with 4 of them? Now, the Farman F220 came to that answer when the Nombrun 14K came out in 1933. The F221 variant was shown to finally meet and exceed the expectations of those specifications that had been sent out a decade before. Now, the world had certainly changed between 1923 and 1933, but by 1930s, the French had a habit of setting specifications based on what was currently available to the aviation industry, and not based on where they would want the industry to be. I did a whole video on this, The Road to Nowhere, where I go over the utter mess that was the interwar French aviation industry. So you should definitely check that out. But now when we're looking at how the French Air Force was supposed to look, the Farman were to make up a single ultra-heavy bomber group, with 6 heavy bomb groups finishing up the strategic force of the Armée de l'Air. The rest of the force would be made up of 44 groups divided between tactical bomber, recon, and pursuit aircraft, favoring the so-called Avion de combat multiplace, and these were to make up over half the total strength of the Air Force. The multiplace was supposed to be a level bomber that could also be a tactical bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, artillery spotter, and heavy fighter. It was getting the most bang for the buck, or frag for the franc if you prefer. This was all based on Douhet's theories about strategic terror bombing and demanded the ability to basically stay over the battlefield, hovering in wait for enemy bombers so as to pounce on them, or the opportunity to support entrenched or fortified ground troops. The new bombers that came in response to the 1928 specification, in 1931, were anything but new and failed utterly to meet the needs of a proper multi-role avion multiplace. The STAE wanted a twin-engined, 4-place, all-metal, multi-purpose aircraft, and they got a mixed bag of marbles. The Sesquiplane Breguet 310, which is an odd duck that resembles something out of an acid-fueled yellow submarine sketch, was certainly among the worst of the 4 aircraft that signaled the need for serious change. The others in the competition all shared the same ungainly designs with open cockpits, open gun positions, and gangly, unbalanced structures. These were the Blériot 137, the SPCA 30, and the Société d'Embouteillage et Construction Mécanique Amiot 140, the forebear of today's topic. With new engines and enclosed cockpits, the Breguet 413 and the Amiot 143 were developed from these. The Breguet had major problems with vibrations in flight and was cancelled after initial order of 50 was rethought on the principle of not having your plane shake apart as if afraid of heights, as French an approach as that might sound. The Armée de l'Air settled for the Amiot. It was supposed to be a maneuverable, high-speed aircraft with the ability to escort other bombers, provide close air support, and loiter over battlefields when it wasn't taking the fight to enemy cities as a medium bomber. Instead, what they got was an awkward aircraft that was too large to do much of what they wanted it to do, although it did provide adequate bombing capabilities and made for an excellent reconnaissance platform when in uncontested skies. The next generation of orders, the 1933 specifications, were for a bomber combat recon aircraft, and this is the BCR, the Bombardement, Chassé, Reconnaissance aircraft that demanded what Greg Baughan called in his Rise and Fall of the French Air Force as, quote, a new generation of ultra-modern, fast, maneuverable, powerfully armed twin-engine planes which would be equally capable of artillery observation, army reconnaissance, tactical bombing, strategic reconnaissance, long-range bombing, escorting, and interception. So it's a tall order to say the least. Now, top speeds of over 215 miles an hour put them in the same range as contemporary fighters. And to meet the maneuverability requirements, Amiot slimmed down the 143, scaled her down, and gave her a retractable landing gear to make her into the Amiot 144. Now, there was only one of these, and it would lose out to a plane that wasn't even entered in the competition, and that was the famous Potez 540, a craft which finally met the French vision of the multi-place combat aircraft. This left the Amiot 143 to be the sole member of the 140 family to enter service. Now, the path to entering service began after the Amiot was selected for production following participation of the sole example of the 140M in the night maneuvers at Nancy in July 1933, and showed its potential mostly as a night bomber. They wanted now to change the design, and that involved expanding the gondola, put on 3-blade propellers, a catwalk to the rear of the aircraft, placed to starboard with the bomb bay moved to the port side, and a radio operator added to the crew. It just made, the larger of the competitors grow even greater in size and more dedicated towards the bomber role, because the French realized they weren't going to get this, a real Aviation multiplace out of this. So the Amiot 141 was never built. A pair of prototypes 142s were built, although the second example flew only after the 143 had already flown. And that leaves us with the 143. The prototype 143 was powered by 700 horsepower Nomron 14KRS and KBRS radials, which were replaced by the 850 horsepower Nomron 14KRS and 14KJRS pair, the KIRS being the clockwise rotating port engine, and the KJRS being the counterclockwise rotating starboard engine. The two were designed to work together, yet were not interchangeable as one might hope would fit a combat aircraft, each engine being made as a mirror of the other. So it wasn't really the most thought-out idea of wars to come. They thought of a static conflict where they would always have spare parts, and really the French idea of a defensive world war is shown even in how they chose engines. Now, the French wanted high-speed aircraft that did absolutely everything and competed with pursuit aircraft and heavy bombers alike, but they also wanted huge aircraft with huge amounts of glass and turrets in every corner. The more powerful the available engines were, the heavier the French wanted their multi-place aircraft to be. It was a strange and meandering path to follow. It was a path that within a year would be ended by cannon-armed interceptors, spurred on by the French themselves with their 1932 fighter specifications. These required the inclusion of the Hispano-Suisse motor canon, and the 1934 specs gave the option of a pair of wing-mounted cannon, or the single cannon through the engine nacelle, and it's something with which the average bomber turret could not compete, with a turret-mounted machine gun that had limited traverse, having to face the stable cannon of interceptors approaching at the angle of their choice, and able to open fire without even entering the range of the bomber's lighter guns. So to put it in perspective, we're looking at the mid-30s manufacture of 1930 design based on 1923 specifications, upgraded in 1928 to meet the demands of 1925, and expected to fight a war in 1940. So now that that's all out of the way, let's get into the 143 herself. Nicknamed L'autobus Amiot and painted like a brick of solid night soil, she was purposely designed for the simplest construction methods and processes available in order to make the best out of the situation of the day, when labor was unreliable and production space was not easy to come by. In fact, the 140 and the 143 both had some advanced characteristics in terms of construction going on for them. Riveting was used to cover the fuselage framework, and the 140M was the first French aircraft to use stressed skin as it replaced the corrugated wing covering of the first prototype. The wing of the 143 used a tubular construction method that not only increased wing strength and lightened the overall weight of the aircraft, but also served to allow the crew to climb into the wing and reach the engines while in flight. The wing itself was huge. It had an area of 1,100 square feet and allowed for slow landing speeds, stable handling, and yet they designed it that it still had a relatively high maximum speed for the day at 195 miles an hour. Granted, 20 miles an hour below what the Air Force wanted, but that's what they got. After the first 40, the engines themselves were moved 10 inches forward from their position, and this offered increased stability and a better center of gravity. She was able to cruise comfortably at about 140 to 150 miles an hour, carried a notable bomb load of 3,600 pounds, and this was divided between the internal bomb bay and wing racks, And her bomb load showed that she was supposed to be kind of all over the place in her roles. She could carry a single 1,100-pound bomb with 4 220-pound bombs on the wings. She could carry instead 1,610-pound bombs. Or, for a tactical anti-personnel role, she can carry 64 22-pound bombs. Now, there were 2 variants, as I began to say. There was the first 40 manufactured, and then there was the rest of the lot. The first 40 had 2 Lewis guns in the rear of the gondola, with a single Lewis gun in the nose and dorsal turrets. The 41st example and all that followed her were completed with an extra foot added to the overall length, a new fuel system that reduced leakage and improved efficiency, and had the Lewis guns replaced by 4 7.5mm Mac 1934 machine guns. So you had 4 machine guns in 4 positions: the nose and dorsal turrets, the floor hatch, and the ventral step. And these were used by the navigator comme bombardier, the radio operator, and dedicated gunners in the nose and dorsal positions. Now, while it seems light, now that we're looking back in retrospect, her defensive armament, and it did leave a lot to be desired, but it wasn't out of touch with contemporary German and British designs. And when she entered service in 1935, however, this was woefully inadequate, as any fighter pilot with the smarts to attack laterally would easily take out the aircraft. And thanks to tremendous blind spots, let alone the range of a 20mm cannon, that rendered the single machine gun mounts of rifle caliber nearly useless. That the Max replaced Lewis guns speaks to how long it took to get from the prototype to the delivery of production models, as it was not reaching units until mid-1935, with the last deliveries being made in March 1937. And this is the same time that, Heinkel HE-111s and Dorniers were wreaking havoc against the left in Spain and their Soviet fighters. And talking about the time, the financial history of the model is one that leaves the accounting part of my brain in shreds. But I knew it was coming since I was discussing France, a nation my family thankfully left for the shores of the New World the second we got a ticket on Cartier Cruise Lines to Port Royal in 1610. In the most French manner possible, the first delivery of 4 examples was made on July 1935. 4. The second contract that was placed in 1935 was for another 73, but these weren't delivered until April 1936. At that time, a batch of 25 was ordered, and these were also put together piecemeal and as finances allowed, all while the French aviation scene was undergoing tremendous change. Let alone that they changed over how the plane was made after those first 40, so in that second batch, you've got half of one style and half of another, with those modifications. So the fact they got out 73 examples in 1 year is good by French standards. And of course, during this time, Amiot was trying to get as much government funding as possible to sustain themselves through the Depression. By the time the final deliveries were made, there were a total of 178 examples of what should have been an economically affordable, easy-to-produce bomber specifically designed to use the simplest manufacturing methods possible. It was not. Let alone that only a year after the last delivery that the Amiot 143 was already being replaced by the Bloch MB131, a much more modern design, but one that would still not completely take the place of the flying omnibus quite in time for the war. Now, during those interwar years, one example did acquire some fame, the E327, which is the 100th example manufactured. She flew from Villacoublay outside Paris to Saigon in French Indochina, one of the most celebrated flights of the day, especially in France. Departing on 20th October, she flew to Rome, Tunis, Benghazi, Damascus, Cairo, Jasq in Persia, and then on to Karachi and Calcutta in British India, and finally on to Saigon. She then turned around and returned to Paris by the same route, her fuselage now decorated with insignia from each stop along the way. Another noteworthy aircraft was number 81, or Blanc 2, of the Section de Pilotage Sans Visibilité at Cazaux. As the name implies, this was the French training unit responsible for blind flying, an essential skill for night bombing. Come 1940, she would see herself pushed into service with Groupe de Bombardement 234, but she was able to survive that, even fly with Vichy forces. But in the meantime, as a training aircraft, she was not advanced, but she was proving herself to be a contributory asset in the French arsenal, in that she basically helped train half a generation of night bombers. Especially, you can imagine this huge aircraft, tons of glass to see below you, and yet you're in the pitch dark. It's quite something to see, and you don't really see that kind of training where you're purposely blinding the pilot to fly on instruments alone at night in a large aircraft in other countries of that time. So the Flying Greenhouse had certainly proven that she was up to the rigors of night flying in the temperate continent and in North Africa's deserts, that she was a capable bomber with a tremendous payload, and that she could perform feats of long-distance flights, and the Armée de l'Air had shown that they could fly intercontinental voyages just like any other nation, but her time in the spotlight was limited by the troubles of the interwar years and the desperate need for French air assets to enter the modern age. Despite her performance in peacetime, she was a better part of a decade behind her peers, and time for France was a shortly rationed commodity. The Munich crisis and tensions in the Far East weighed heavily on the French military both in metropolitan France and in the Outre-mer, but there was only so much the unstable interwar governments could do, and none of it seemed to benefit the air industry. When the war broke out in 1939, a single North African, Groupe de Bombardement, was equipped with the Amiot, as were 5 metropolitan groups. They were 134 and 232 in the north, 138 and 238 in the east, and 263 in Africa. Interestingly, there are references to them being used by Polish forces in exile. However, the Polish were arranged into various training units and groupes de chasse in the Zone d'Opération Aérienne des Alpes, so references to a Groupe de Bombardement Marche Polonaise seems a mite off to me. And as she had shown herself suited back in the moves of 1931, she mostly flew in night attacks and night reconnaissance, often crossing over the German border to drop deadly loads of leaflets in hopes of begging the Germans into surrender. She did perform a single daylight bombing raid once, when 10 examples were sortied against the German bridgehead during the Battle of Sedan. Escorted by French fighters, losses totaled 2 shot down and 1 grounded in a forced landing, and the effects were minimal. However, she acquitted herself well in a reconnaissance role when escorted or flying at night through the phony war, if not after the commencement of the German offensive. 52 143s would survive the Battle of France and be put to use in Vichy-controlled territories as transports and bombers, together with the 25 present in French North Africa. Her final operational days were served with both Vichy and Free French forces, the latter having received several from Groupe de Bombardement 238, which was surrendered to the Australians and British following the invasion of Greater Lebanon. There's no record of them being put to use, however. Meanwhile, in metropolitan France, they had mostly run their course, and a scant dozen were still around by the time that the Vichy French were occupied by the Germans, and the few flight-worthy examples were being used as hacks and light transports by the French and then the Luftwaffe. So, while she is considered among the stranger birds of French interwar aviation, she was not as all terrible as her visage might imply. If we were to collect the oddball avion multiplace from the French of the time, the Berguet 460 Voiture certainly takes the cake as being a flying hotel, despite the retractable undercarriage slimming her down to a tadpole on crack shape, and her ability to outpace the Amiot 143 by 60 miles an hour, the inclusion of a fixed forward-firing 20mm cannon in her defensive array. It all still left her completely open to attack from the sides, and with only 2 single-mount machine guns to cover her tail, it wasn't a great improvement. The Farman F222 was similarly boxy and only half a step towards modernity despite her 4 engines, while the Bloch 210 was designed in the mid-30s from the high-wing Bloch 200, and resembled in many ways, or at least in my opinion, the Junkers 86. Yet here she carried fewer bombs than the 143, was only 5 miles an hour faster, and she wasn't that big an improvement. So both the Farman F222 and the Bloch 210 outfitted bomber groups in the spring of 1940, and were also used along with the Amiot as night bombers. And this is the trio of bombers that makes up the move from the budget-conscious demands of designing for a multiplace that could never be, to designing for a medium bomber that was only half-suited for the job. Outpaced and outgunned by nearly every other nation's bomber and fighter forces, they represent an evolutionary period that took the French a decade to overcome, where most nations took about 3 years. And the French were clearly not sure where they were going. Advanced designs were being produced by 1938, but they were still dependent on this idea of the multiplace bomber that did everything. The Amiot 143 flying omnibus may have been awkward from our perspective, but among the boxy, cartoonish, underpowered French designs coming out at the time, she wasn't a bad design at all. For comparison, the British had the Bombay's first flight in 1935, though the Bristol bomber and transport was certainly more streamlined, and the RAF knew that by 1939 that she was best fit for colonial duties and transport. The French had clearly come to the same conclusion about the 143, but did not have the opportunity to move in that direction, since there were insufficient numbers of other aircraft to take her place. Now, the Bombay is worth mentioning since she was a development of the bag-shot fighter prototype, and also introduced stress skin and panels riveted to the framework, a fixed undercarriage, 2 power plants, a comparable bomb load, albeit with slightly less powerful engines and even weaker defensive armament. Had the Bombay been designed with enough glass for a built-in gardening center, the two might have been more comparable. The difference is that the Bombay was designed to be a bomber transport. The Amiot 143 was designed to be a high-speed day and night bomber, fighter, escort, and recon platform. It might have done a good job at 2 of those roles in a tactical setting in 1935, but strategically, and by 1937, she was a craft of a dying age. So, if you'd like to learn more about the French interwar aviation industry, do check out my video, Road to Nowhere, where I go over the decision-making pathways of the industry in those turbulent years leading up to the war. I have to give credit where credit's due in this regard, and if you want to read up on whence my notes came, I recommend Greg Baughan's The Rise and Fall of the French Air Force, and his book The Rise of the Bomber. The latter is on the RAF during the interwar period and is very good. The famous In Action series by Squadron Signal that I'm sure decorates most of our bookshelves also has an interesting section on the 143 in their volume on French bombers of World War II, and that's aircraft number 189. Most photos you see here happen to come from there, and there's really, I apologize for the dearth of moving pictures. There just aren't really many movies of the 143, I have to admit, and it's a shame. Because it always looks so blocky in 2 dimensions that when you see it fly, you see that it actually wasn't as awkward looking as you might think at first glance. But all that said, I hope you found this video entertaining as usual, and I know my interwar stuff is some of my most popular. Do be sure to check out Road to Nowhere. I know it's, for some reason, not one of the popular videos, but it is definitely one that's worth watching. There are also videos that make up a trilogy. The other ones are on the German and Italian interwar aviation industries that are in there. And if you like this video, hit the thumbs up button. If you're not subscribed, you're missing out. And finally, if you want to see more of this content, please do consider a membership. Channel memberships begin at 99 cents. You get a free postcards and other merch. You can also join Patreon for as little as $3, and every little bit helps out, as it all gets reinvested right here. So thanks again for joining me today, and as always, this is Claire, and I am the Warbird Mistress. Cheers, my dears, and take care.